Caddis Maximus here, this time with a review of the Autozone 62-900 two-piece flex extension set in 3/8 and quarter-inch. They actually have individual part numbers, 52-128 for the 3/8 and 52-024 for the quarter-inch. And nicely enough, they did stamp the part numbers onto the tools themselves, which seems to be becoming a bit more rare these days. These are the kind of interesting spring type. I'm not exactly sure how they work inside, if there's a bunch of linear straight rods with the spiral wrapped around it, or if it's just a series of concentric smaller and smaller spirals. But that's how these types of tools have always worked. A lot of them are very cheap. It's kind of odd, but you'll see, you know, not dollar store, but real cheap tool sets that will have like a little quarter-inch driver with this type of thing, and those have always been real terrible. But these Duralast ones seem to be, you know, made for doing more work. I wouldn't recommend breaking really stuck or rusted fasteners with these types of tools. I would at least find some way to break the bolt. But these otherwise can be quite handy and are a nice alternative to other types of flexes, such as, you know, universal joints or constant velocity flex joints like this impact style. But surprisingly enough, these things are actually a lot more rigid than I expected. Really, a whole lot more rigid than, because you would expect to use them and it would just be really springy and they'd be kind of a joke maybe or gimmicky. But these actually seem quite real. You do feel a little bit of twisting and tension in them, but only when you're actually applying a fair amount of torque. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend using these with an impact driver because the impacts could either get it loose. Also, a little bit of torsion that it does have will absorb a whole bunch of the impact energy. Remember, impact can be very powerful, but if the nut is welded to the end of a spring and it's bouncing around, then you could have the world's most powerful impact and never get the nut to turn at all just because it's all being absorbed. Something to remember about impacts. So the other feature about these versus these is, one, it goes around a curve. What's kind of interesting about these Duralasts, and the other part that made me think that they are a little bit higher quality, is many of these types of spring flex, when you start flexing them, they'll just allow you to flex them all the way over 90 degrees. They don't feel very well put together, as I just said, and then they never go back straight, where these Duralasts are actually surprisingly true running. And when you do bend them, they'll bend maybe, I don't know what that is. I don't know if that's 30 degrees. That's what this little thing is rated for, is 30. So maybe overall you'll get 30 degrees of arc out of it. But it's interesting is right about there you can feel it stops, almost like there's a couple little, some kind of piece of wire with two little ends that are moving about, and then they just stop. It's just the hardest thing to describe, is you start bending it and then all of a sudden it just stops. It gets a lot more rigid. So I think you'd cause a permanent bend if you went around too tight of an arc. But that's the point, is that it can get around an arc versus the bend just being in one concentrated spot. Of course, another deal is how much smaller diameter this is than using one of these joints. The issue with a standard universal joint, say you have a fastener, speakers in a door, or maybe speakers under the back window of a sedan or Taurus, where you need to get around an angle and add a screw, surprisingly enough. The problem with universal joints is you just can't really put much pressure. You got to try to hold the actual socket while twisting with your other hand. So universal joints are just impossible to use in those situations. The impact style CV joints are much better because they hold, one, they don't bind up, and two, you can actually put pressure onto the fastener and hold it with the adapter and then turn it. So these do work for screws pretty well, except for this is just such a large diameter. So of course you have one of these, and this is actually kind of an interesting setup. Instead of using the spinner handle, which makes it a little bit long, you use a thumb spinner, and now what this is a flexible screwdriver, and that's actually pretty handy. And even though I have a flathead in here, with the Phillips, it does stay pretty well centered, and you can actually push down pretty firmly, pretty hard, to actually, get a good purchase. Get a good grip so you can remove that fastener. And the fact that when you use a thumb spinner, you are kind of helping support it with your hand. So I thought this is just a real handy thing, and that's really one of the big reasons is to use it exactly like this as a flexible screwdriver. If you have one of those Phillips head screws that are bent and the head just kind of like wobbling back and forth as you're unscrewing it, something like this is actually kind of nice because it will kind of follow along with the bent screw as you're unscrewing it. That way you're not like unscrewing it some and then the driver slips and you have to move at a different angle. That's always a bit annoying. I think these were actually on sale on the shelf. These were I think they were $10. I think the normal price is $12. AutoZone had a bunch of stuff on sale. So another thing is the 3/8 I like the idea of is for spark plugs, because it's always seems to be easier, or excuse me, I should say the hardest thing for me at least with spark plugs and a lot of awkward engines, particularly V6s. I don't do car repair videos because I have a really beat up old car that it's embarrassing. So I'm not going to do that until someday when I get a better vehicle to work on. Or at least one that doesn't, isn't visually so bad as the one that I currently have. But it has a 3.3 liter. It's a 96 Nissan Pathfinder, and the cylinder 6 spark plug hole is it's impossible. You can't actually physically see it without an inspection camera. Really pretty annoying. So, and it's kind of at an angle, and it's always really hard to try to get a socket with an extension just absolutely at the perfect angle to get the thread started. So something that has just a little bit of flex there will kind of allow the fastener, whether it is a spark plug or a normal fastener, to kind of self-align, and can make it a lot easier to get things started in really awkward situations. But it has that springiness and rigidity, and so it works better in that respect than even something like this, where you kind of get it started, but it does really want to wobble side this, pretty far off. This always kind of wants to stay straight, but allows it to move a little bit, and it has really been a lifesaver. I'll do maybe my next video. I actually don't think I've owned any CTA tools. Went by a mom and pop shop, and they had this little 14 millimeter 12-point spark plug socket. Those are hard to find. Anyway, enough about that. That was just a review of these Autozone Duralast spring-type flex extensions. And I would like to get a 1/2 inch, but I think for at least their sale price for $10, these are actually pretty high-quality spring-type flex extensions and worth owning. They can really make some situations just a whole lot easier. They're the kind of tool that you wouldn't use every day, but man, when you do have them and the situations you can use them in, could easily save you a huge amount of time or frustration or busted knuckles, etc. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing, and if you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.